Chapter 23 discusses a time period in American history known as the Great Depression. Let's go ahead and begin by discussing sort of what caused the Great Depression. The beginning of the Depression is sort of signaled by the crashing of the stock market, Black Tuesday, Black Friday, in the fall of 1929, when Herbert Hoover was president. But that's not what caused it. The stock market crash is a result of the causes of the Great Depression. Stock market crash signaling basically the failure of America's top businesses, which would have then led to not only loss of money for investments in stockbrokers, but more importantly, the loss of millions of jobs when those businesses closed or had to scale back production. But essentially, when you look at the Depression, you have to look back to World War One. So in the previous chapter, we discussed the devastation in that faced primarily Europe in World War One, and the fact that these economies, primarily Germany, never recovered, and as a result, they were not able to purchase goods from American businesses like they had previous to World War One or during World War One, when the United States was supplying the Allies with the weapons of war. So that's a big issue, is that the world economy, which was becoming more globalized, more interconnected, never really recovered from the tragedy of World War One. The second one being sort of, when you go back one chapter to the Roaring Twenties, this conspicuous consumption, this buying on credit, poor banking practices, tragedies in agriculture as a result of Mother Nature, the Dust Bowl, the droughts that the Great Plains experienced. It's essentially a perfect storm of an economic collapse that will become known as the Great Depression. Now, Herbert Hoover, from the laissez-faire Republican school of the less federal government intervention, the better, which had worked in American politics to an extent outside of, some sort of regulation and reform during the progressive era, is going to inherit the worst economic crisis that the United States had seen. And he will attempt many progressive remedies, public works through the construction of the Hoover Dam, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, support for the congressionally led Smoot-Hawley tariff, the Kellogg-Briand Act, a lot of things that at the time were very progressive, that got him a lot of criticism from his Republican counterparts, that later in history people will forget, and they'll sort of look at Hoover from the face value of, this guy was a calculating engineer who was unsympathetic and had a failure to empathize with the plight of the American people during the Depression. And as I say often in my lectures on Hoover and the Depression, is perception is reality. The people felt like he didn't care about the fact that they were unemployed and living in shanty towns called Hoovervilles, that he didn't care that American unemployment reached a height of 25%, 56% amongst African Americans. The fact that he seemed unsympathetic when he failed to comply with the demands of the bonus army. And it didn't matter if he was actually doing a lot. The people felt like he wasn't, and that's going to usher in Franklin Delano Roosevelt to the White House in 1932. What's amazing about the presidential election of 1932 is that Hoover was so unpopular and the Depression was so damaging that all Franklin Roosevelt had to run on for his platform against Hoover was the New Deal. I'm promising the American people a New Deal. And outside of saying that he supported the repeal of the 18th Amendment, he didn't have to say much else. And that's the thing that drove Hoover crazy, was Hoover at these speeches, like his Consequences of the New Deal speech at Madison Square Garden, was he'd say, this guy that you're going to vote for is promising you to fix the Depression and telling you none of the details about it. This is dangerous. Hoover, especially being an engineer, saying, show me your plan, show me the numbers, right? And FDR saying, look, we're just going to try things. We're going to try things. And when they fail, we're going to admit it. And when they work, we're going to celebrate it. But by God, try something. And basically what you had in the presidential election of 1932 was the perceived inaction of Hoover versus the promise of rigorous experiment, bold experimentation is what FDR called it. And he'll win in a landslide by millions of votes. The popular election, he'll win by a large margin in the Electoral College. And this is a changing of the relationship between the federal government and the American people. Prior to the Depression, prior to the implementation of the New Deal during Franklin Roosevelt's presidential terms, the American people really had very little interaction with the federal government. They had much more interaction with their state governments. And the elections for governors and state representatives, even mayors, was a much bigger deal to the American people. The federal government was there to wage war and conduct the military. Probably the most interaction the American people had with their government, with the federal government in Washington, D.C., was the Postal Service, which was run by the federal government. Other than that, didn't really have any interaction. I mean, the federal income tax had just been implemented by the 16th Amendment. So this is what is going to change. You're going to see a fundamental shift in the relationship between the federal government and the American people with the implementation of the New Deal. The first thing that FDR did with the New Deal, it's sort of what is often called, or in the alphabet soup, the AAA, the TVA, the CCC, the WPA, the NRA, right? All these acronyms for all these programs that were implemented. Essentially, it was the federal government becoming an employer of the American people, a massive employer of the American people, putting millions of people to work through the series of those programs. The TVA, which built a dam to provide cheap electricity to the Tennessee Valley area. The CCC, which put young men to work in public works programs, building parks, building schools, building hospitals. That's the first part of the New Deal. The second part of the New Deal was putting in place federal regulatory programs that would ensure that the Depression, to this extent, would never happen again. This is your Social Security. This is your Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC. This is the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, that's going to regulate the stock market and banking practices. The FDIC, which is going to ensure bank deposits so that people have faith in banks again. Social Security, providing insurance for the disabled, for the orphaned, for the elderly, and importantly, forcing Americans to save a part of each paycheck for that quote unquote rainy day. Remember, 9 million Americans lost their life savings when the bank closures hit and as a result of the start of the Great Depression. Social Security was the federal government's answer to insulating people from the private banking practices that sometimes could be unstable. And as I saw, 9 million Americans, by no fault of their own, lost their life savings. I can remember my grandparents who grew up during the Great Depression never really truly trusting banks to the end of their life, using a checking account to pay bills. But really, the bulk of their cash was kept on hand because they just didn't trust those banks, even with FDIC. So you see a tremendous change in the relationship between the federal government and the people, and you see a Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal that offers this hope, the possibility of what the New Deal could be. And for a lot of people that were impacted by the New Deal, they loved FDR, and this guy was the greatest person ever. But ultimately, most Americans were not helped by the New Deal's programs. If you didn't get a job because by the CCC, or you weren't assisted by Social Security, you didn't like him. And he had a lot of critics. Huey Long from Louisiana, who had his Share Our Wealth program, said FDR is not doing enough. We need to do more. Conservatives on the right said FDR is the man in the White House that's ruining this nation. They said it's creeping socialism, it's welfare, it's creating a generation of people and a nation that will now become financially dependent upon the government for their well-being. FDR's own mother refused to sign up for Social Security, saying, "How dare the government force me to save part of my paycheck?" These are the things that are going on. You're going to get an FDR that tries to increase the size of the Supreme Court. The court packing scandal, when a lot of his programs are thrown out by the court, is unconstitutional. But ultimately, what you're going to end up seeing is that by the end of his second term, the United States is being sort of forcefully pulled into the conflict that is known as World War II. And the United States will once again benefit from their neutrality at the beginning of World War II by, Henry Ford opens up his automobile plants, and instead of making Model Ts that no one's buying, they're making airplanes, they're making tanks. And once again, you have a militarized economy as a result of a world conflict, and the United States will stay out of it. And that's what will be discussed, at least initially, until Pearl Harbor in the next chapter.